She slept beneath a broken wagon for 3 days, until a silent mountain man said, "Come home." The sun was setting on the dusty plains, casting a warm golden glow over the landscape. The wind howled through the open fields, a constant reminder of the vastness that stretched in every direction. There was no sign of life, no sign of help. Only the sound of the creaking wagon, barely holding together under the strain of the journey. The woman sat in the dust, her back against the wagon wheel, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. Her journey had started weeks ago, when she left behind the only home she had ever known. The small town had become suffocating, the memories of her family's loss too painful to bear. She had packed up what little she owned, determined to make a fresh start somewhere new. But the wild frontier was not kind to anyone, especially to those who dared venture into its heart. As the days passed, the land grew harsher. The roads turned to rough trails, the days longer, and the nights colder. She had faced many challenges along the way, but nothing had prepared her for the feeling of being truly alone in the wilderness. She had heard stories of people lost in the wild, never to return, and the thought sent a shiver down her spine. Yet she pressed on, determined to reach the distant town she had dreamed of. It was supposed to be her new beginning, a place where she could rebuild her life. But now, with her wagon broken and no hope of reaching her destination any time soon, she felt the weight of failure press down on her like a heavy blanket. The wagon had given out in the middle of nowhere, and she had no choice but to wait. There was no shelter, no cover, only the wide open sky above and the endless expanse of land stretching out before her. She had considered walking, but the terrain was treacherous, and without the wagon she had little to carry with her. No, waiting was all she could do now. The woman pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, trying to ward off the biting cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. She glanced at the broken wagon, the wheels mangled and the wood splintered. She had tried to fix it herself, but there was no fixing something like that. It was beyond repair, and she had no tools to do it even if it wasn't. All she had left was a small satchel of provisions, enough to last a few days at best. But that was not the worst of it. The worst part was the loneliness. It wrapped around her like a suffocating fog, and she could feel it creeping into her soul. She had been alone for as long as she could remember. After losing her parents to the sickness that had swept through the small town, she had found herself an orphan, with no family left to turn to. She had lived with the thought that if she could just leave, if she could find somewhere new, somewhere far away from the memories, she could escape the pain. She had dreamed of the day she would step off the wagon in the new town, free from the weight of loss, ready to start again. But now, all of that seemed like a distant dream, slipping through her fingers like sand. She was stuck here, alone, with no way to move forward. As the night grew colder, the woman lay down beneath the broken wagon. She wrapped herself in the blanket she had managed to pull from the cart, though it was thin and offered little warmth. She stared up at the sky, the stars twinkling in the distance, distant and indifferent to her suffering. She thought about what her life had become. This wasn't the future she had imagined. It wasn't the future she had dreamed of when she set out on this journey. She had envisioned something different, something better. But life had a way of throwing obstacles in the way, and it often seemed like she was powerless to do anything about it. Her stomach growled, reminding her of the limited food she had left. She had enough to get by, but it wouldn't last long. She couldn't afford to waste anything. She closed her eyes, trying to sleep, but sleep eluded her. Every time she closed her eyes, the loneliness seemed to grow. The emptiness of the land around her was overwhelming. She had never felt so small, so insignificant, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a mistake coming here. Maybe she should have stayed in the town, with the memories and the pain. At least there she wouldn't be so alone. Hours passed, and the cold became unbearable. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, but it did little to keep the chill at bay. She had always been strong, but tonight she felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. What if no one ever came? What if she was truly alone, stranded in this barren wilderness with no one to help her? She had heard stories about the mountain men who roamed the area, silent and solitary, but those stories had always seemed like nothing more than legends. She didn't know if they were real or just something people talked about to pass the time. Either way, she wasn't sure if she wanted to meet one. The thought of another person, a stranger, out here in the wild, only added to her fear. She wasn't sure what she was more afraid of, dying alone or meeting someone who might not help. The hours dragged on, and eventually, exhaustion took over. She drifted into a restless sleep, though it was fitful and filled with strange dreams. In one, she was back in the small town, surrounded by the people she had once known. They looked at her with pity, their eyes full of judgment. They whispered behind her back, their words sharp and cruel. She woke with a start, her heart racing, but the dream faded as quickly as it had come. The cold, the loneliness, and the silence returned, leaving her with nothing but the dark sky above and the barren land stretching out in every direction. It was then that she heard something, a faint sound in the distance, a rustling in the wind. She strained her ears, trying to make sense of it. For a moment she wondered if she was imagining things. But no, there it was again, a soft sound, like footsteps, coming closer. Her heart skipped a beat. Was it someone? Was help on the way? The sound grew louder, and she sat up, straining to see through the darkness. She held her breath, waiting, hoping. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The night was silent again, and the woman was left alone, with nothing but the stars above and the sound of her own heartbeat. She lay back down, her mind racing. Had she heard something, or had it all been in her head? It was hard to tell in the wilderness, where everything felt so isolated, so far removed from the world she had once known. She closed her eyes again, but this time sleep came more easily. She was too exhausted to fight it any longer. The dreams came again, but this time they were different. In one, a figure appeared, a man with a strong, silent presence. His face was obscured, but she felt his calm, reassuring presence. He was there, standing in the distance, waiting. She didn't know who he was, but in her dream he seemed to be the answer to her loneliness. She reached out to him, but before she could touch him, she awoke once again. The sun had risen once again, casting its golden light over the desolate landscape. The woman squinted against the brightness, the light seeming almost mocking in its warmth. She had hoped for rest, for a miracle, but each day felt like a repetition of the one before. It was the second day since the wagon had broken, and she was no closer to figuring out how to get out of this wilderness. Alone in a place where the land stretched out endlessly, and the wind howled as though it too were lost. The first day had been a blur of fear, fatigue, and frustration. She had slept little, trying to keep herself awake in case help arrived, but no one had come. The sun had set that evening, and she had made her bed under the broken wagon, her thin blanket doing little to shield her from the chill that crept in with the night. The cold had settled into her bones, deep and relentless, just as the silence had settled into her heart. As she sat up now, the morning sun did nothing to comfort her. It only served to highlight the futility of her situation. Her food was already running low, and she had no idea how much longer she could survive on the little water she had. The wagon still sat there, broken and useless. The landscape around her was a desert, empty and uninviting. Nothing moved, not a leaf, not a bird. The silence was suffocating. She couldn't even hear the distant sound of animals or the rustling of trees. It was as if everything had abandoned her. The weight of isolation seemed to grow with every passing hour, every minute that ticked by. The woman's stomach growled painfully. She could only ration her food so much, and the water was running low. She hadn't expected this, hadn't prepared for being stranded in a place so far from help, so far from any kind of civilization. Her thoughts wandered back to the life she had left behind, her family, her friends, the town she had hoped to escape. Everything she had thought she wanted now seemed so far away, so distant. She had wanted to leave the pain behind, but now the pain had followed her, in the form of loneliness and uncertainty. She reached into her satchel and pulled out the last of her bread, biting into it slowly. The bread was dry, and it made her throat feel scratchy as she swallowed. She didn't have much left, and she knew she had to make it last. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to block out the gnawing hunger and the fear that was beginning to creep in. Her mind raced. What if no one came? What if she was truly alone in this vast, unforgiving wilderness? But even as the fear tightened its grip on her chest, she knew she couldn't give up. She couldn't. She had to survive. She had no choice but to push through the fear, to keep moving, to keep hoping. But how? What was she supposed to do now? There was no clear path forward, no way to know where to go. The town she had dreamed of reaching was miles away, and without the wagon, she couldn't walk there. She didn't even know if it was still in the direction she thought. She had no map, no compass, nothing but the open sky above her and the endless land that stretched in every direction. The wind picked up again, swirling the dust around her feet. Dying, she stood, brushing the dirt from her skirt and trying to take in the scene around her. There was nothing. Just empty land. And her. The stark reality of it hit her all over again. There was no one coming. No one to help her. It was up to her to figure it out, to survive on her own. She could feel her resolve hardening, the determination building inside her. She had faced worse before, hadn't she? The loss of her family, the pain of starting over. She had survived all of that. This was no different. She had to believe that. She checked her water supply again. It was low. There wasn't much left. It would not be enough to last through another day, let alone another few days. She couldn't stay here. She had to find a way out. She had to keep going, keep moving forward. The thought of walking away from the broken wagon was almost unbearable, but she knew it had to be done. It was her only option. The morning passed in a blur of quiet activity. She gathered what little she had left and packed it into her satchel, knowing she couldn't waste anything. The wagon sat there mocking her, its broken wheels a reminder of everything she had lost. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't let herself give up. With a heavy heart, she turned her back on the wreckage of the wagon and began to walk. Every step felt heavy, but she pushed forward. The terrain was rough, the ground uneven beneath her feet. She stumbled a few times, but each time she steadied herself and kept moving. The sun beat down, but the heat didn't feel as oppressive as the cold of the night. The air was dry and the landscape seemed to stretch endlessly in front of her. There was nothing but more dust, more dry earth, and the occasional cactus or shrub. She tried to keep her thoughts focused on the task at hand, but her mind kept wandering. How far had she walked? Was she heading in the right direction? Would she ever find anyone? The loneliness was overwhelming. She couldn't shake the feeling that the land was closing in on her, that it was swallowing her up. She had been alone for so long, but now it felt different. It wasn't just isolation. It was a complete and utter disconnection from everything she knew. She had left behind her old life, thinking that it would be better, that it would be easier. But now she wasn't so sure. The wilderness didn't care about her hopes or dreams. It didn't care if she was strong or weak. It was indifferent, and that was the hardest part to accept. By midday, she was exhausted. The heat was starting to take its toll, and her water was nearly gone. She found a small patch of shade beneath a rock outcrop and collapsed beneath it, feeling the weight of her weariness settle in her bones. She couldn't keep walking like this. She had to find something, anything, that could help her. She needed to find water. She needed to find shelter. She needed to find something that could pull her out of this nightmare. As she sat there, her eyes closed against the brightness of the sun, she heard something. A faint rustle in the distance. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but then it came again. She strained her ears, trying to make sense of the sound. Was it a person? Was it a horse? Could it be help? She stood, her heart racing, her mind filled with a sudden burst of hope. The sound was growing louder now, closer. She turned, trying to peer through the haze of heat, trying to see through the dust, but there was nothing. No one. Her shoulders slumped in disappointment. It was nothing. Just the wind. The same wind that had been with her from the start. The wind that had carried away all of her hope. She sank back down onto the ground, defeated. There was no one. Not now. Not yet. All she could do was wait and hope. But deep inside she knew the truth. She was on her own, and somehow she would have to find a way to survive. The day stretched on, and with every step she took, the weight of her situation became harder to ignore. The heat of the sun beat down relentlessly, but her mind felt cold, weighed down by the uncertainty that had followed her since the first moment the wagon broke. Every step was a struggle, every movement a reminder that she was alone. But despite the fatigue, she continued. It was all she could do. She had tried to make it last, stretching each sip for as long as she could, but in the end, it had run out. Her throat was dry, her lips cracked and sore from the lack of moisture. The blistering heat only made it worse. She had never imagined being so close to desperation, yet here she was, struggling to hold on to the very thing she had always taken for granted: hope. She had always believed that she could handle whatever life threw her way, but this was different. This was something she had never prepared for. But despite it all, there was still a small, flickering spark inside her. A spark that refused to die. It told her to keep moving, to keep fighting. She had made it this far, and she couldn't stop now. She had to find something. Anything. But what? The land around her offered no answers, just endless stretches of dust and rocks. It was as if the world itself had forgotten her existence. Hours passed, and she walked with no particular destination in mind. The ground was hard beneath her feet, and the air seemed to get thicker with every breath she took. Her body ached, her muscles sore from the exertion. She knew she had to keep moving, but the lack of water was taking its toll. Her thoughts grew hazy, and her vision blurred. She stumbled once, then twice, but she caught herself each time. The last thing she wanted was to fall and stay down. She had to stay on her feet. She had to keep going. It was then that she heard it. A sound. It was faint at first, so faint that she wasn't sure if she had imagined it. But then it came again. A soft, rhythmic sound like footsteps on the dirt. Her heart skipped a beat, and she stopped in her tracks, straining her ears. Was it just the wind again? Or was someone out there? The possibility made her pulse race. She stood still, listening carefully, praying that it was not another cruel trick of the desert. The footsteps grew louder. They were real. She wasn't imagining it. A surge of hope rushed through her, and she spun around, her eyes scanning the horizon. There in the distance was a figure. At first it was just a silhouette against the bright sun. But as the figure drew closer, she could see more clearly. It was a man. A tall figure, dressed in weathered clothing, with a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. He moved with an ease that came only from years of experience in the wilderness. He was calm, unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. The woman's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know if she should run to him or wait. She was too tired to move quickly, but the sight of another person, another living soul, made her feel an odd sense of urgency. She needed to reach him. She needed help. But before she could take another step, the man stopped. He didn't approach her directly. Instead, he stood still, studying her from a distance. His eyes seemed to scan the surroundings, as though he were assessing the situation. He didn't speak, didn't move forward. He just watched. The woman's heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't sure what to do. Should she call out to him? Should she ask for help? But what if he didn't help her? What if he was just another person who would ignore her, leave her to fend for herself? But there was something about him, something that felt different from the cold emptiness of the land around her. He wasn't hurried, he wasn't agitated, he wasn't suspicious. He simply stood there, waiting. For a moment she wasn't sure if he was real. Was she imagining this too? Her exhaustion and thirst could have played tricks on her mind. She rubbed her eyes, trying to clear the haze, but when she looked again, He was still there. The silence between them stretched on, heavy and uncertain. She didn't know how long it lasted. It felt like an eternity. But then, he took a step forward, slowly, cautiously. He didn't rush, but he moved toward her, his boots kicking up dust with each step. The woman's breath quickened. She felt a mixture of fear and relief. Here was someone, finally. But who was he? And what did he want? When he was close enough, he stopped again. The distance between them was still wide enough that she couldn't make out the details of his face. But she could feel his presence. It was calming, steady. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. For a moment, the woman didn't know what to say. She wanted to ask him where he had come from, where he was going, and if he could help her. But all the words she wanted to say caught in her throat. She felt like she had forgotten how to speak. Instead, she simply stood there, waiting. The man studied her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he reached into the bag at his side and pulled out a canteen. He didn't offer it to her immediately. He held it out as though giving her a moment to decide if she was going to take it. The woman's eyes fell on the canteen, and she felt her throat tighten. She was so thirsty. The dry desert air had made her mouth feel like sandpaper, but she didn't want to appear weak. She didn't want to beg, but she couldn't help herself. She took a cautious step forward, her hand shaking as she reached for the canteen. The man didn't stop her. He simply watched, his expression unreadable. She unscrewed the cap and brought it to her lips, savoring the cool water as it flowed into her mouth. It was like a lifeline, something she hadn't known she needed so badly until it was there. She drank deeply, feeling the life return to her body with each swallow. When she finished, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and handed the canteen back to him. She didn't know what to say, but the words were no longer necessary. His gesture had spoken for him. The man hadn't said a word, but somehow he had understood exactly what she needed. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to relax. The tension that had held her body so tight seemed to release, and she let out a shaky breath. She wasn't alone anymore. The man didn't ask her what had happened, or why she was stranded here or where she was headed. He didn't need to. He just stood there, waiting for her to gather herself. There was no hurry, no pressure, just a quiet understanding that she would take the time she needed. After a moment, he nodded toward the horizon, silently indicating that she should follow him. He didn't need to speak. She could tell from his calm manner that he wasn't leading her toward danger. He wasn't asking for anything in return. He was simply offering help, and that was enough. Without a word, she nodded, signaling her willingness to follow. She didn't know where he was going or what awaited them at the end of this journey. But at that moment, it didn't matter. She was no longer alone. The man led her through the desert in silence, each step sure and steady, as if he knew the land better than anyone could. She followed him, her feet dragging in the sand, but her heart felt lighter. She had been walking alone for so long, and now there was someone beside her. She couldn't quite explain it, but his calm presence made her feel safe in a way she hadn't felt in days. Every step felt like a small victory, a little more hope returning to her. They moved through the vast landscape, the sun still high in the sky but less harsh than before, the breeze picking up in the late afternoon. Her legs were sore, her body aching, but the sight of him, this silent stranger, gave her a quiet strength that she hadn't known she was capable of. The journey felt less lonely now. He didn't speak, but his actions spoke louder than words ever could. There was no pressure to explain herself, no questions to answer, just the steady rhythm of walking together. The land around them began to change slowly. The dry earth was replaced with patches of sparse grass, and the flat ground gave way to gentle hills. She couldn't help but wonder where they were going. The man didn't give any clues, but there was no need to ask. She was learning to trust him, just as she had learned to trust the land when she first set out on her journey. The feeling of being lost was starting to fade, replaced by a sense of quiet curiosity about what lay ahead. As they walked, she felt the weight of the past few days begin to lift. The fear, the exhaustion, the loneliness, they were still there, but they no longer consumed her. She focused on the sound of her footsteps in the sand and the steady, calm presence of the man ahead of her. It was hard to believe that just a few hours ago she had been on the verge of giving up. Now she felt a spark of hope flickering inside her, just enough to keep her moving forward. They walked for what felt like hours, with the man occasionally glancing back to check on her, but never speaking. She wondered what had brought him here, to this part of the wilderness. Was he traveling too? Or had he been here for a long time, living alone in the mountains or the desert? The curiosity gnawed at her, but she didn't ask. She didn't feel the need to know everything right away. She was learning to appreciate the silence, the quiet understanding between them that didn't require words. Eventually, the man stopped. She nearly bumped into him as she wasn't expecting the sudden halt. He turned and gave her a brief look before motioning ahead. There, just beyond a rise in the land, she could see a small cluster of trees, an oasis in the middle of the barren desert. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized what she was looking at. It wasn't just a patch of trees. It was a place of refuge, a place that promised water and shelter. They walked toward the trees, and as they got closer, the sound of running water reached her ears. The cool, crisp sound of a stream made her throat tighten. She hadn't realized how thirsty she was until the sound of water filled the air. They reached the edge of the stream, and the man didn't hesitate. He knelt down and cupped his hands to scoop water from the clear stream. He drank deeply, then offered his hands to her without a word. She didn't hesitate this time. She knelt beside him and drank from the stream, feeling the cool water rush into her mouth, soothing her parched throat and bringing life back to her tired body. The water refreshed her in a way she hadn't known she needed. It wasn't just the thirst that had been quenched, but the exhaustion in her body, the ache in her bones. She drank until she could drink no more, then leaned back, resting on the ground by the water's edge. The man, still silent, settled beside her. They didn't need to say anything. The simple act of finding water, of reaching this place together, spoke volumes. As they rested by the stream, she noticed the small things about him: his weathered hands, the worn leather of his boots, the roughness of his clothes. He was a man of the land, someone who had spent a long time in places like this, places where survival was the only concern. There was something deeply reassuring about him, something that made her feel as if she could relax for the first time in days. She wanted to ask him more about himself, where he had come from, what he was doing out here in the middle of nowhere. But she didn't. She didn't want to break the peace of the moment. She didn't want to rush anything. The silence between them had become a language all its own, one that didn't need to be interrupted. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. It was clear that nightfall was approaching, and the man stood up, motioning for her to follow. She didn't hesitate, knowing that staying in one place for too long could be dangerous, especially in a place like this. She rose to her feet and followed him toward the trees, where he seemed to be headed. They moved quietly, almost as if they were part of the land itself, blending into the surroundings. As they reached the trees, the man stopped again. There, tucked between the trunks of two large oak trees, was a small, modest cabin. It was made of rough-hewn wood, and the roof was covered with dried grass and leaves. It looked old, but sturdy. It wasn't much, but to her it felt like a sanctuary, a place of safety. She stopped a few paces away, unsure if she was welcome. The man didn't speak, but he turned and motioned for her to come closer. His face was still unreadable, but there was something in his gesture, something quiet, something patient, that told her it was all right to approach. She walked slowly toward the cabin, her heart beating faster with each step. As she got closer, she could see the small details of the cabin: a stack of firewood beside the door, a small porch with a rocking chair, and a few pots and pans hanging from the roof. It was simple, but it was enough. It was everything she had hoped for since she first set out on her journey. The man opened the door and stepped inside. He didn't wait for her to follow, but she did anyway. As she entered the cabin, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't just the shelter from the night's cold. It was the feeling of being somewhere safe, somewhere that could offer her a rest from the trials she had faced. The cabin was small but cozy. There was a fire burning in the hearth, and the smell of something warm, perhaps stew, filled the air. She had no idea how long he had been living here, or if he had even planned to take her in. But there was no question in her mind now. This was a place where she could rest, where she could heal. As she stood inside, the man moved around, placing some wood on the fire and making sure the small space was ready for the night. He didn't say a word, but his actions were clear. He was offering her not just shelter, but a chance to breathe again, a chance to recover from everything that had happened. The woman didn't know what the next day would bring, or what this strange, silent man had in mind for her. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could rest. She could stop fighting, if only for a moment. The journey wasn't over, but for now, it felt like it had led her to a place of peace. The warmth of the fire flickered in the small cabin, casting long shadows against the walls. The woman sat near the hearth, her eyes following the dance of the flames as they crackled and popped. The heat felt comforting, soothing after the endless days of wandering under the harsh sun. She felt an unusual peace in the air, a quiet stillness that had eluded her for so long. For the first time in days, she felt her body start to relax, the tension in her muscles slowly easing. The man moved about the cabin with quiet efficiency, tending to the fire and preparing something in a pot over the hearth. She could hear the faint clinking of utensils as he worked, but he didn't speak. There was no need for words. She had learned that much already. Everything he did, every movement he made seemed to have purpose, and she didn't need him to explain it. She wasn't sure when it happened, but she had begun to trust him. Trust him in a way that was rare for her. Trust him even though they had only just met. She watched him for a moment, observing the way he moved, calm, deliberate, as if this was a routine he had known for years. There was something in the way he carried himself that suggested he had spent a long time in the wild, far from the bustle of towns and cities. There were no words, no explanations needed. It felt like he had his own way of living, a rhythm that the world had taught him to follow. The fire crackled again, and the scent of the stew began to fill the room. The woman's stomach growled softly, reminding her of how long it had been since she had eaten a real meal. She hadn't even realized how hungry she was until the aroma of food reached her. She felt a wave of gratitude toward the man, though she didn't know how to express it. Words seemed so small for something as big as this. She wasn't used to accepting help, let alone feeling this kind of relief. But right now, she didn't care. She simply allowed herself to feel grateful for the warmth, for the food, for the safety of the cabin. The man finally turned and placed a bowl of stew in front of her. It wasn't fancy, but it didn't need to be. It was simple, hearty, and nourishing. She took the bowl, her hand still trembling slightly from the exhaustion of the journey, and brought it to her lips. The first bite was like heaven, warm and comforting, something she hadn't realized she had been missing. The flavors were rich, and for a moment she forgot about the loneliness, the fear, the uncertainty that had consumed her for days. All that mattered in that moment was the warmth of the food and the sense of peace that surrounded her. The man sat down across from her, his own bowl of stew in his hands. He didn't speak, but there was something in the way he sat, the way he looked at her with those calm, steady eyes, that made her feel like she wasn't alone anymore. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was just natural. It was as though they didn't need words to communicate, as though they both understood each other in ways that words couldn't capture. She ate slowly, savoring the food and the quiet that filled the room. Outside, the wind still howled, but inside the cabin everything was calm. It was a stark contrast to the wilderness she had walked through, a place where survival was the only concern. Here, she felt like she could breathe again. It wasn't just the food or the warmth, but the feeling that she had found a place of refuge, a place where she could rest. She had been so used to fighting for survival, fighting for a chance at a new life, but now, for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could let go of the fight, if only for a moment. When she finished her meal, she placed the bowl down gently, feeling the fullness in her stomach. She wasn't used to feeling satisfied like this. It was a strange feeling, but one that she knew she would grow to appreciate. The man didn't say anything, but he got up and gathered the bowls. He moved with the same quiet efficiency, cleaning up without making a fuss. There was no need for pleasantries. There was no need for formalities. It was just two people sharing a quiet moment in the midst of a vast, untamed world. After a while, the man stood and walked to the door. He opened it slowly, the cool evening air rushing in, and looked out into the growing darkness. The woman, still seated by the fire, hesitated. She didn't know what to do next. She had been so focused on survival, on getting through each day, that she hadn't thought much about what would come after. She had been so consumed by the fear of being alone, of never finding help, that she hadn't allowed herself to think about the future. But now, in this quiet cabin, with the fire crackling softly and the man standing by the door, she realized something. She wasn't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to keep fighting all the time. Maybe it was okay to stop for a moment and just be. The man glanced back at her, his expression still calm, still unreadable. But there was something in his gaze, something that made her feel like he understood. She had no idea where he had come from or why he had helped her, but in that moment, she didn't need to know. The simple act of being here, together, in this small, humble cabin, felt like enough. The world outside still felt vast, still felt uncertain, but inside this cabin, she felt a sense of peace that she hadn't known in a long time. He stepped outside, and she watched him for a moment, wondering if she should follow, but she didn't. She stayed by the fire, her gaze fixed on the flames. The wind outside had picked up, but the cabin felt warm, a sanctuary from the wild world outside. As the evening deepened, the man returned. He didn't say anything, but the small, steady presence he brought with him felt like a promise. The promise of safety. The promise of something more than survival. It was the kind of promise that didn't need words. The night stretched on and the fire burned low. The woman didn't know what the future held. She didn't know what her next steps would be or where the road would lead. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she had to figure it all out. She didn't need to plan every moment, every detail. She didn't need to fight the world around her anymore. In this cabin, with the silent mountain man who had offered her help without asking for anything in return, she found something she had lost along the way. Peace. And that, for now, was enough. As the fire flickered out and the darkness settled in around them, the woman closed her eyes, the weariness of the journey finally catching up to her. She let herself rest, knowing that tomorrow would come, and when it did, she would face it, just as she had faced everything before, with quiet strength, and with the knowledge that she wasn't alone anymore.